Hello and welcome to book launch and discussion of an announcement of a new book series from NUS Press and the discussion of the first book in this series. My name is Peter Chopert. I'm here in Singapore. It's a Monday morning for us. It's a Sunday evening for some of our guests, and thank you for joining us. You know, architecture. Questions of location and place would seem to be important in architectural studies. They should be, right? So when we were looking at a book series with our network of scholars and friends in the region, we really wanted a book series that started from a position and a perspective that has something to do with the networks that we're placed in here. So we wanted a series that looked at things from the perspective of the global South, and that started really from the networks and the sensibilities that we're used to calling Asia. And so that's kind of where we started off with this series. Also, the series, Across the Global South, Built Environments and Critical Perspective, it's a kind of architectural studies that intersects with cultural studies, post-colonial studies, art history, urban studies. And so we wanted it to be extending outwards in a disciplinary sense, as well as in a geographical sense, but again, from a critical perspective. We have two of our series editors here with us to celebrate the launch, and of course, the author of our first book in the series, Jakarta, City of a Thousand Dimensions. So first, let me introduce you to our series editors. Professor Anoma Pieris is a post-colonial scholar who's published widely on nationalism, citizenship, and sovereignty, paying particular attention to marginalized social groups and conditions, but again, from a perspective of the built environment. And Lee Kah Wee is assistant professor at the Department of Architecture at the School of Design and Environment at NUS. His research areas include architectural theory and trans-regional urban studies, and he's published his book, Las Vegas and Singapore, Violence, Progress, and the Crisis of Critical Modernity with NUS Press in 2019. And of course, our first book in the series is Jakarta, the City of a Thousand Dimensions. What a better place to explore new ideas and new networks and new connections in the built environment than with Jakarta. But I will let Prof. Anoma Pieris introduce the author of that, Prof. Abidin Kusno, and tell us a little bit about the book and get us started. We'll be here for about an hour or so is the plan. And do stick around because we'll have a discount code so that you can purchase the book at a special price at the end of the hour. Anoma, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for introducing our series. We are very excited about this. And Abidin is, of course, our first author in the series. So Abidin counts among the key thinkers for our discipline, especially for those of us invested in architectural and urban studies of Southeast Asia. He is professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University and was formerly the director of York Center of Asian Research. For a major part of his academic career, Abidin was the Canada Research Chair in Asian Urbanism and Culture at the Institute for Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. I have known Abidin personally for many years now as part of the cohort of PhD students of Anthony D. King, who spearheaded the social focus of our work. But I know Abidin more intimately through his books, beginning with Behind the Post-Colonial, published in 2000 with the Architect series, and since then through several volumes, The Appearance of Memory, Visual Cultures of the Ethnic Chinese, After the New Order, and with this latest book on Jakarta, the City of a Thousand Dimensions. Through these books, he has inserted and sustained Indonesian places and concerns as part of our imagination of and conversations about the Global South. Abidin, welcome to this book talk series. And I will begin by asking a few questions, and then Associate Professor Kah Wee will take over and ask a few questions, and we'll go back and forth. So The first question is about your intellectual and personal motivations. What drives your interest in Jakarta? And how has this interest shifted across your many books to bring us to this particular volume and its approach?
Okay. First, let me thank Peter and Sana for organizing this book talk, and also thanks Anoma Kah Wee and Farhan, who is not able to be with us today, for including Jakarta in the book series. And thanks Anoma for your first question. This is a question on subjectivity, which is a central issue for scholars interested in the global South. We are indeed not only a scholar or an expert in our field, but we are also a member of a particular social order. So the question then is, what drives my interest in Jakarta? Jakarta is where I once lived and worked, and it is the home of my parents and families for about 35 years now. But we were not originally from Java. We came from North Sumatra. And before settling down in Jakarta, we lived in Surabaya, and that was for about 8 years. And that is where I had my high school and university degree. And so for us, everything we saw in the late 1980s in Jakarta was not only new, but also overwhelming. You know, just the visual contrast, right, in the very landscape of the city, you know, say between the rich and the poor, is way more visible than Medan or Surabaya. And everything was already moving very fast then. And we know we were at the center of a very rapid urban development. But we also know that that center doesn't give us a perspective of what is going on. So the choice of Jakarta is grounded in both personal and intellectual reasons. Personally, I think it is a continuous attempt to make sense of a place where I considered as my home city. And this process of making sense of the city is continuing. So all of my books are about Jakarta, not because I know so much about the city, but it's actually quite the opposite. You know, I don't quite know the city, and I just want to know more. And maybe that's why I write about it, right? With some worries, as I know my families live there. So I think this is reflected in the kind of stories I told in the book. You know, I found myself like jumping around, trying to reach out to something and make connection between different things from the positions of both an insider and also outsider. So what drives me intellectually is in fact the questions of the nation, of nationalism and also nationhood. And this seems to me is a major topic of concern for global South scholars. And since the beginning, I've been interested in exploring the relation between the city and the nation, what they have done to each other. As for the questions of what I bring, what is this particular volume is about? Well, my first book, right, and the subsequent two other books, they were really all about these questions of new time, right? There's a kind of a mood of wondering about the meaning of new time, of moving forward, you know, and what this could mean for the city. And this particular volume, Jakarta, the City of Thousand Dimensions, I think it started in 2012 when Jokowi became the governor of Jakarta. and we know that he became president 2 years later. So in some ways, the book is about his era, right? Is about his relationship with Jakarta. I should say that, and in some way also what he should know about it, and so. And I remember, when he became the governor of Jakarta, I was excited to see someone like him, like with his background, stepping up as a leader. And I asked myself and friends, if we could consider his era as a new episode in the history of the city and the nation. And so I started to explore that by writing from that time on to get a sense of his time, right, and to get to know onto what conditions he was responding, and the kind of actions he took, and spaces that were then produced. But the book is not organized around Jokowi. He's just one among many social actors in the book. The book is organized around different urban issues that are actually quite familiar to students of urban global south. uh, Irregular settlements, informality, infrastructure, and environmental disasters, new town, and so on. And but they were all brought together by three interconnected topics of governance, urban form, and everyday life. And I have to confess that I didn't quite know how to end the book, until I think 2019, when Jokowi announced his plan to basically say bye bye to Jakarta. He just wants Indonesia's capital city to be elsewhere. Now that gave me some ideas about what the book is about, and how my existing scattered essays could be revised and organized as chapters. And more definitely, I somehow know how to end the book. So in some way, I think now, we can say the book can be understood as a story about the decline or demise of Jakarta as the capital city of the nation. So I think that is my reflection, Anoma. Thanks for this question.
So I had a kind of connected question about what it means to look at Indonesia from a Java-centered point of view. But before I ask you that question, it occurs to me that for us who are doing work on Asia, and this book series is from the Society of Architecture and Urban Historians of Asia, many of us, and kind of why we put the word urban into the name of our association, is that we always are juggling the political, the national, and the urban, right? And these things are the most changeable in our experience of the places we come from. So the national is this new thing that comes after colonization for many of us. The urban is being transformed, but the political is in some ways exaggerated in our lives because of the level of politicization of the economy and everything that happens to us. And it seems that in your books, you return to these three things over and over again, but at different stages in the history of the city. And this is more a reflection than a question, but it seems that that's a valuable method for many of us who do work on Asia. And it really resonates with us. So to get back to my second question, what is left out in a Java-centered approach to Indonesia? And this is a question not just for you, but for all of us who tend towards our capital cities when we try to tell the stories of the places that we are from. So what happens when we take this, and what is left out?
Yes. I think that's an important question. Especially the student of Global South is very, very aware of the problem of say Eurocentric perspective, right? And one can think about Java-centric perspective in the same problematic way. Yeah. And for me, a book on Jakarta does contribute to reproducing Java centrism, no matter how critical the book is about Jakarta, because the primary concern is still Java, where the city is located. But in a way, I think for myself, it is not so much Java itself that interests me. I guess I'm really not trying to write a history of Jakarta. I think I was more trying to make Jakarta engage with current debates in architecture and urbanism, and that's what you were helping me to point out. All these key themes, right? For Asian urban studies. And it is really to reflect on questions that are important to the student of urban global South, right? Such as the global legacy of colonialism, the changing role of the nation state, say in the neoliberal time, and what the city and the nation have done to each other. But in a way, Jakarta is a good illustrative example for discussing global South. It is a city that once, I think in the 1950s, right, tried to be a symbol of what Sukarno would call third world liberation movements, a capital of decolonizations, and also a site for the mobilizations of some kind of a South-South collaboration. We still remember Sukarno saying something like Jakarta would become a beacon for emerging nations around the world. And that is actually the kind of a global South theme, but that was in 1950s. But now we are actually in a totally different era. Yeah, and we can now frame Jakarta, as a new colonial urban center, not so much, a site for the mobilizations of third world liberation. And we now begins to be more convinced that it has long been part of capitalist world economy. It was called Batavia, headquarters of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, arguably the world's first multinational corporation, before becoming a capital city of Dutch East Indies. And today is a global city, a product of contemporary neoliberal capitalist modernization. And so looking at how the spaces in Jakarta have been produced, conceived, and lived, over time should make us think about the possibilities and the challenges and also the contradictions facing cities in the global South today. Yeah, so thanks for that question, Anoma. I guess it is about how to locate Jakarta in our understanding of the global South. Yeah.
I think that's your cue, Kah Wee, for your question, because it's directly now shifting towards the global South. Thank you, Abidin.
Right. Thanks, Anoma. So now that we're moving into the question of the global South, so the book series is very much about the global South, doing work in and about the global South. So I think when I was reading the book, and I hope that I think you have lots to say about this, that one of the recurring idioms of cities in the global South is that lack of planning. There's this idiom of lack. And from this sense of lack emerges an urbanism that is often described as messy or informal. But I think this conceptual framing can be problematic, especially when such qualities are romanticized or essentialized, and especially when it leaves unexamined the global north as the norm. So in writing this book about Jakarta's lack of planning, Jakarta as a city of the global South, how have you wrestled with such conceptual pitfalls?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Kah Wee. I think this is an important observation and also an important reminder. Indeed, global South is a relational term, and is often set in contrast with the global North, right? And this in fact has then led to a series of Eurocentric ideas associated with Orientalism, modernization theory, and so on. The stories is that the South is exotic and also threatening at the same time, and the South is messy, informal, unregulated, underdeveloped, etc. It is therefore needs to be modernized, with the assistance from the global North. So goes the story. And on the other hand, the global South has also been conceived as a kind of a source of inspiration for an alternative space, and for a critique of Western systems of thought. And there's also a strand of thought that consider the global South as ahead of the West, in the race for privatizations of urban infrastructural network. So what we see here is that the South is conceived in the kind of an East-West binarism. And what has been overlooked is the kind of a South-South or inter-South relations, like as a collective political position, to find a part of development that would be more egalitarian and less environmental degradation. So I agree with you, Kah Wee. And to go back to your questions, as you perceptively point out, I did use the notion of lack of planning, right, in my depiction of Jakarta. I probably should have said lack of social planning for the whole city. Yeah. For there has been very little investment by the state to build, an integrated universal infrastructural ideal, right, as a medium for pursuing social justice and welfare within the city and the nation. So the socially oriented high modernism or modernist planning has never been part of Indonesian urban history. So there's hardly any serious engagement with social or public housing, which is an essential part of modernist planning history. And most housing constructions were undertaken by the private sector, and what I mean by private sector includes kampung. Like kampung people, they did a lot of private planning. I think this is what I mean by the lack of planning. But actually, that is not the main point of my book. My point is that the lack of planning has become a statecraft. It has become an art of governing, a form of governmentality. So the question is no longer what is not covered in planning, but what we discover in the politics of lacking planning. Yeah, and in which the subaltern subjects they too are also engaged in its formulation. Yeah, but thanks, Kah Wee. I think you allow me to mention this point. It's really more on the politics of the lack of planning rather than the lack of planning itself. Right. That was my target. Yeah.
Right. No, that is really helpful. I think when I was going through the book, I thought that, and I suppose the question was to get you to clarify what is has been debated quite a lot in the literature. Ambiguity and I suppose informality as a form of statecraft, I think, is something that has been discussed both in the global South and the global North. So it's something that I think is a key sort of entry point in sort of disrupting that, something that can often be quite binary in terms of conceptualizing cities. So I think that is a great intervention. So to sort of lead from that question, a question about, I suppose, producing theory from the global South. Now, there has been a lot of interest in sort of producing urban theory from South-South, and now we have South-East. Basically, these kinds of different geopolitical connectivities, arguing that these Southern perspectives are empirics are often passed over or trivialized within theories produced in the global north. When you described earlier about the history of Jakarta and how it positioned, at one point in time, it saw itself as, I suppose, a beacon, for post-colonizing cities. I think this is a really important point, that there's both a history and a geography to the global south. So how does this book contribute to this larger intellectual project of producing theory from the south? And what can Jakarta tell us about the global south as a site of theory production?
Great, thank you, Kah Wee. Thanks for opening this conversation up. And I guess my first point here is to remind myself the difference between 1950s, the Sukarno era, the whole idea of decolonizations, and our own time, in which we all seems to have to be entangled in what is called the neoliberal, globalization sort of era, and so in the context of our time, right, which has long been dominated by theories produced in the global north, it is indeed important to try to reposition the global south as a site, for the production of theory. But I also think that such an intellectual project to dislodge Eurocentric perspective, it shouldn't prevent us from reading the rich critical theories produced in the global north. We know that many great thinkers of the global south, they actually came out of a very engaged reading of works by critical scholars in the global north. People like Samir Amin, Fanon, Edward Said, Arif Delik, among others. But you are right. I think what is also important is that we should pay more attention to critical thinkers from our own region. My own take on this is that the kind of a generalizations, either comparative or historical generalizations, that are often assumed in urban theory, indeed needs to be problematized, and we can always try to find a way to unsettle, the assumptions, right? Problematizing them and rework them, and in order to expand the field. So there's always an opportunity to see Eurocentric perspective through what I think Benedict Anderson used to call an inverted telescope. So we can play with them to open our own space for theorizations. So this Global South book series and indeed encourages us to think about our subjectivity, right? And ways of locating our scholarship differently. As far as the book is concerned, I certainly would like to see Jakarta more as a method, as a way of thinking. But I'm not sure to what extent the book has contributed to making the Global South as the site of theory production. I nevertheless tried several things in the book. I try to show that there are various ways to capture urban experiences, just to invite some thinking about different urban knowledges. And I think the second one is that I try to hold a conversation with different theoretical ideas, just to explore areas that are relatively marginal in urban theory, such as things that Anoma has mentioned, the questions of nationalism, and there's also the role of religion, memory, and imagination, and how all these might contribute to the urban questions. And I also juxtaposed, say, post-structuralist concepts, of, say, the rules, right, with concepts developed by Indonesian scholars such as Seno Gumira Ajidharma. He's a really productive novelist, right? And seeing them as parallel, even though they're not from the same time. And then the Kampong chapter, the first chapter, it would not be possible without world system studies, which is arguably Eurocentric in its formulation, but it allows me to see the world in a more structural way. So there's no dominant theories in the book, but there are only conversations with theories and also with the city as well. And I guess the last point I could make is that I also try to locate myself in the book as both, subject and object of analysis. But I must confess that when I wrote this book, the intellectual project of the Global South were not my primary concern, and maybe it wasn't there, until this book series came to my mind, and your questions really have made me think, about how might this book, which was to make sense of the city, experientially, experimentally, subjectively, and speculatively, could be understood as part of the Global South's intellectual project. But Kah Wee, I must say, what is challenging about your question is the potential to build a theory program, like one that is based on understanding critical positions of the Global South. For example, right? What if I move beyond Jakarta, right, to consider other cities in the Global South? How do you do comparative study, right? Or make connection. How do you relate Jakarta with other cities, right? In terms of Global South structure of feeling. I think that is the challenge that you are posing here. I don't know what you think about this, Kah Wee, but thanks. Yeah.
No, thanks, Abidin. I think what I get from reading parts of your book is that there is this, in your words, a irreducible multiplicity to how one can read and experience Jakarta, and so that multiplicity comes across in both the way you write about Jakarta and also the way the book is structured. And perhaps that is also one approach to experimenting with modes of comparativity across cities in the Global South. So rather than replacing one theory with another theory, rather than adopting, I suppose, if I interpret Benedict Anderson in a rather crude way, a kind of inverted telescope where it's still a kind of one versus one type of relationship, but rather sort of multiplying and refracting the different perspectives that one can bring by moving across different sites. And I think in this case, your subjectivity as a kind of almost a diasporic entity moving between two worlds, I thought that comes across in the writing as well. And I think that really brings that kind of, that is as I've said, is a certain kind of uneasiness, maybe. I'm not sure if I'm using the correct word, but definitely a sense of movement and that these are partial perspectives, and they're always in the process of making and remaking itself.
Well, thank you, Kah Wee. I think this should be the afterwards. That's great. Thanks.
Okay, so maybe I'll pass it back to Anoma. Okay. So maybe I think Anoma is missing, but she'll be back. So my next question is, how would you reinterpret could you tell us something about the Islamicization and the politicization of the city, the utopians that are imagined and left behind, and the city that is being re-envisioned?
Thanks, Kah Wee. I think one of the themes that has increasingly become important in in considerations of cities in the global south is religion and urbanizations. It's about the place of religion in, say, a secular state, and how might politics come into play. But of course, first we must recognize that all these terms like religion, secular state, politics, and the urban, they are never fixed, right? And they can be contested, in their relations with each other. Historically, right, we can also think about how the colonial state constructed religious domain, right, quote unquote, selectively to manage the diversity of religious practices in their different colonies. As someone who grew up in Southeast Asia, religious activities are part of everyday life, and often, as you are aware, that we have hard time differentiating cultural practices from religious practices. So how these are managed or not managed by the state, and how they entered political domain, to me are profoundly interesting. So the chapter on Islamist urbanism, I think this is where your questions come from, is trying to grapple with these issues here. But there's a context we need to understand. Under Suharto, religion is one of the sensitive issues that must be controlled, and it must not become an uncontrollable political force. So Islamic organizations were largely, have to organize themselves around social missions, right? And because the regime would not tolerate something like political Islam. But the post-Suharto era opened a kind of a space for Islam to move from what we would known as what we know as social Islam to political Islam. So the looseness in the center and democratic transition and so on have made possible politics to be organized around religious identity. And so there were Islamic political parties, and characteristic of Indonesia. There are also many different takes on Islam. And so in that chapter, I only look at a particular Islamic movement, which associated itself with a political party, and they were interested in assuming power in the city, and perhaps with an intention to also influence, if not take over, the nation state. So that chapter was about the emergence of Islam-based political movement, which Indonesians called Islamist in the post Suharto era. So these Islamists, we have to say that they are not representing the Muslim majority, but they were gaining influence, by going to the street, to the national square, to perform spectacles, right, of their political subjectivity. And so in that chapter, I explore Bandung and Jakarta. Yeah, Bandung is in West Java. Yeah, and I look at how public spaces and urban landscapes have been infested with Islamic values and practices, right, associated with the Islamists. And so the capital city became the site of contestation, especially when it was under a governor who has a Chinese Christian background. He's a tough guy, and he had no hesitation, to evict kampong residents using military and police forces. And he was soon framed as anti-Muslims and defeated by someone who was supported by Islam-based political party and organizations, including Islamic hardliners. So that was a story in that chapter. And we know today the movement is in decline, partly because the state intervened and arrested some of the hardline leaders and banned their organizations. They are now a bit quiet, but some believe they are hibernating. And And as far as the new city is concerned, I actually have not seen any proposal for a new city under the banner of Islam, but there are some Islamic housing complexes, but there are more mosques, designed in a very spectacular way by architects, avant-garde architects in Bandung and Jakarta. Yeah, and so that is my kind of a take on that chapter. And I remember when I wrote this, I was actually somehow quite haunted by, if you remember, Mike Davis' book, Planet of Slums, and his remark or his observation that in the developing world, in the urban sites where infrastructure and social welfare are neglected by the government, like religious parties and organizations, such as those of the Islamists, would come as a source of social cohesion, among city dwellers. But this is not happening in Indonesia, maybe because political Islam is only a kind of a small fraction of Indonesian Islam. And furthermore, the major Islamic political party is called the PKS, has never been able to win the heart of the urban poor. Yeah, so I'm just trying to make kind of an Indonesian Islamic sort of a chapter a bit more complex.
Okay.
Yeah, but thanks, Kah Wee.
Thank you.
There was a point that was also kind of in that question about utopia, the idea of a utopia, and the idea of the new capital and the move, and the difference between that earlier idea of Jakarta and the new idea of Jakarta. This kind of utopianism that we link sometimes to religion and sometimes to a kind of political vision. And this is something also that might be good to tease out, I think. So utopianism in these contexts. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. There's kind of interesting that there are so many. Now the idea of utopia is no longer just a no place, but it is also there's also attempts to invest meaning and value, and these values can be religious, can be all kind of identities, into what we call the no place of utopia. This to me is the most interesting. This is an opportunity for us to reflect on this idea of utopia in the kind of say global South or Asian context. Because the whole struggle has a lot to do with how to deal with the hegemonic power, right, of the world that is structured so unequally, and part of the whole struggle to achieve utopianism sometimes can not just be a kind of a no place utopianism, but in utopia that would have to take have to be invested with certain values, whatever we call it, like values that is connected to identity. Yeah.
And I think the politicians also use it rhetorically in projecting their kind of political vision and getting kind of trying to convince people to allow them to build these new cities.
Yeah.
They call on these cultural ideas of utopia in order to substantiate these processes. Yes.
Yeah.
So that also, I think, is an interesting recurring practice, especially since in the post-colonial period and after. Every time they have a new vision that they put forward, and the way it links to these earlier ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, it's less about the universality of the utopian idea, but now it is more the specificity of it, right?
Exactly.
Which is really interesting. Anoma, you're right.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of my cue to take on the next question, Abidin. So thank you for that. And my question is about an idea that you have developed across, from beyond the post-colonial into what we call in this book, middling urbanism. So the middling modernism is something we are familiar with because of Rabinau and the way he interpreted it in his project, French Modern. So tell us a little bit about this idea of the middle. So middling modernism or middling urbanism. What is the role that the middle plays in our understanding of Asia?
Yes. Great. You really have picked up one of the points that I think is so important and is clearly not quite discussed in the book. But let's begin by I think the key question here is the connection between middling modernism and middling urbanism. What is happening here, right? And as Anoma points out, we know that Paul Rabinau published a book called French Modern. It's a book about history of modern urbanism in France in the late 19th century and up to close to the mid 20th century. Now, central to the book is a battle between two concepts, which Rabinau characterized as middling modernism, and the other one is techno-cosmopolitanism. And he used the term middling modernism to indicate the transformations of a kind of a high modernist universal ideal into a practicable administrative and welfare system, for the actual governing of population. So it's essentially a Foucauldian framework which focuses on the micro practice of actual urban programs. So I think in Rabinau, the notion of metering means practicing, right? I think it would have been more precise if he just used the term practicing or practicable modernism. When I think about his metering modernism, I've always thought of Singapore, as an example. Right? It's a state's technocratic approach to achieving efficiency, to maximize science and control society through social welfare. Right? So you have a really great example of metering modernism. So in that sense, the concept of metering modernism is not so useful to talk about kampong, right? Because the states, historically, since colonial time, they tend to stay away from kampong. So kampong cannot be analyzed in terms of the concept of metering modernism. The state will intervene kampong when it is only needed. Otherwise, they just leave kampong alone. So my use of metering in metering urbanism actually has no connection with Rabinau's concept of metering modernism. And so I guess if I were to still make connection with Rabinau's work, it would be through his other concept, techno-cosmopolitanism, which is the opposite of metering modernism. In any case, the term metering in my kind of use in metering urbanism, it actually refers to the idea of middle, in between. If we look at the dictionary, right, metering is basically moderate, like somehow ordinary, not extreme. Being in between two places. Spatially speaking, it would be something between the rural and the urban. So the urban kampong, which is like the village in the city, is a place in between of two places. So for Rabinau, it would be like the milieu. It's a relational term without metaphysical grounding at all, right? And of course, we could also bring in Jennifer Robinson's idea of ordinary cities. Like metering also mean ordinary, but I want kampong to be not just ordinary. I want it to be central. That it is central to the international division of labor, and it is central to the order and stability, or even sustainability of Jakarta. So central that if you take it out, right, the whole city would collapse. That kind of argument, right? If you take kampong out of the city, then there will be an immediate confrontation, if not a battle between the city and the village. Right. So I want it to be a political concept, in other words. So metering urbanism, in some way, I want it to be a political concept. And then so the task of that chapter is to figure out the logic or the art of governing from the middle. Right. Well, I guess there's a context too. That chapter was written in response to the forced eviction in 2015. Evictions of hundreds of residents living in Kampung Pulo in Jakarta. They live along the riverside, right? They were evicted by the city government under the pretext of normalizing river so as to save the environment, right? Which was to minimize, flooding. So I thought it's important at that time to register the importance of Kampung as a kind of a keystone, right, or almost like a foundation of urbanism in Jakarta, and it serves to moderate and increasingly polarize urban and rural system. And of course, the second argument is more economical. Trying to locate Kampung in the international division of labor, that it is so structural, right, to the functioning of Indonesian economy, right, formal and informal. And so I mobilize all this, from what I learned in world system studies, and then the rest of that chapter on metering urbanism is just try to look at the way in which the middle is governed. It is governed only indirectly or partially by the government. So Kampung is largely self-managed. Which means that it is relatively autonomous in relation to the centralized system of power. It is governed by intermediaries, what they call the kampung rule. And this goes back to a much longer history that has to go back to the colonial time, how kampung was constructed, in a way that it would always be ruled by the intermediaries, not by the state. So that would be my kind of take, and so yeah.
I think that's perhaps one of the theoretical kind of concepts that you're introducing to us that we can maybe go with, because many countries in Asia we don't kind of industrialize our subjectivities to the extent that you might find, say, in East Asia, in Japan or Korea, right? Because we haven't gone through the process of industrialization. So we still have these kinds of complex identities that are entangled.
That's right.
And that, I think, is in some ways expressed through this idea of the middling.
Yeah, you're right. That's interesting. So and is hybrid in its formation.
Exactly.
Right? You can bring in the pre-colonial, practices mixed with colonial art of governing, and it get carried over to the post-colonial time. But Anoma, I think what you are trying to say also, I think it is also relevant to any other cities as well. Say in the context of neoliberal, governmentality, right? We know that there's this move of reducing the state's responsibility for social services, like by way of promoting community participation, partnership, privatizations, resilience, do it yourself, self-help, right? These are familiar terms when it comes to the way Kampung self-manage itself. Right. So in the context of global South with histories of colonial and neo-colonialism, right? So these initiatives that we learn from neoliberal urbanism, they are not new. Right. Some of these practices could be found in say, now I would use metering urbanism, right? And that had been used since colonial time.
Yes, I just want to. Yeah. Kavi?
Yeah, I thought I want to chime in here to say something about what you mentioned earlier, that this for a long time, you've been concerned about the relationship between the city and the nation, and that one important subject that is still very important to us in the global south is that nationalism is still very much alive, and it's not, it's not a finished project, or So I think the way we talk about nationalism, not necessarily as state ideology, but as these actionable programs that is undertaken by a whole range of experts and what Rabinowitz will call technicians of general ideas, right? I think that really broadens the way we think and understand the nationalist project. From my perspective, writing about Singapore, there's always this, a very similar kind of a problem where politics have been sort of siphoned out of nationalism, and what's left is a kind of an administrative state or administrative nationalism. It's just a series of programs of improvement. And I think that is, where I suppose architecture and urban studies, when we focus on specific spatial practices, can be really important and useful, because it starts to break down this very blocky ideas of ideologies, of state ideologies. We start to look across, these rather diverse, a much more diverse range of spatial practices. And I think that is, when I was reading the book as well, that really came across to me.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kah Wee.
I think that's kind of also a cue for the next question, because what we witnessed during the pandemic is the way in which these other bottom-up processes kind of came and took over and served to be the forces that differentiated our cities and responses. But I think that kind of begs that environmental question. So Kah Wee, why don't you raise that? The last one.
Sure. So we have the last question. The last question is, in your book, you talk about environmental change. You talk about flooding, massive road infrastructural development, and of course the pandemic. And you have been one of the early proponents of this lens of approaching Southeast Asian architecture in your previous books. So what do these new challenges pose to the insular ways in which the environment has been interpreted in the past?
Okay, thanks, Kah Wee. There's a tendency in say environmentally focused studies, right, to forget about socio-political issues, and we can also see such tendency in architectural discussion on environmental and sustainability issues, right? How Southeast Asian architecture tends to subscribe to the techniques, of ecological modernization as a design paradigm for solving problems of urbanization in Southeast Asia. And in this book, and in some way also in the previous one, I basically try to indicate the socio-political implications of environmentalism, right? How people in fact are displaced, in the name of saving the environment. And in this Jakarta book, I basically try to make more explicit my attempt to bring socio-political issues into the discussion on environmental change. I was trying to say something about the difficult relation between social equity and environmental sustainability. That efforts to handle environmental issues such as flooding have often resulted in displacement, of marginalized populations. So take, say, the normalizations of Jakarta's rivers, right? Is meant to prevent flooding, but then it required the evictions of kampung residents who live along the riverside, and so on. So the challenge then is to consider environmental sustainability along with social sustainability, that they cannot be separated, right? And we know that Jakarta is a city divided by differentiations of infrastructural provision since the colonial time. So how the environmental disasters such as flooding, traffic jam, and finally the pandemic are handled, in such a divided city is the questions that the book somehow try to address. But I can't say that I have all the answers. Touching Jakarta is like touching water. You know what that feels like, right? You touch something and nothing at the same time, right? So the chapter on flooding, it basically led me to everywhere, just like the way of water. And so the issue is more than just that the government find it hard to handle, right? Environmental issues such as flooding, and it is also not just a matter of technological fix. There are socio-political interests that cannot be technologically fixed. And it seems to me there can be more problems if the government actually try to fix it. So if we follow the way of water, which is the method I was using, we find that there are already various existing forms of self-management, water self-management, self-water management in place that are still working, and no matter how inadequate they are, right? These are localized, privatized, improvised, precarious informal infrastructures that one would not recommend, but they nevertheless work, right? So flooding can be devastating. It can be anywhere, and it can come at any time. But somehow it is tolerated, and it is expected too, right? It's considered normal. And at a deeper level, it's coming and going has been integrated into a pattern of everyday life, into social relations, and also into political life. So that issues on the environment one, it teaches me something, the seemingly ungovernmentality, like say of flooding. Nevertheless, it has provided a ground for enterprises to propose projects, for solutions, for architects to imagine the city through their design, and for activists as well to call for change, right? And also for politicians to use for political campaign. So part of the life of flooding is preserved in the domain of business, in politics, and also in the imaginary. So in the end, what we can say is that the city's residents in Jakarta, they are very resilient. They continue to live and to thrive under the threats of environmental disasters. But we can also say that they continue to live and thrive under the state of denials, of environmental disasters. So that is the kind of things that I learned by writing, the chapter on flooding, on environmental issues. Thank you, Kah Wee.
Thank you.
So I think that brings us to the end of our questions, and thank you, Abidin. I'm going to hand over to Peter to complete the session.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you, everybody. What a fantastic, rich conversation. Thank you to our panelists, Anoma Pieris, Lee Kah Wee, and of course our author, Abidin, for starting off our series across the Global South, Built Environments in Critical Perspective, with the discussion of his book, Jakarta, the City of 1,000 Dimensions. I hope everybody listening and watching that this has given you some idea of the richness and pleasures of the book, which are multiple, which have 1,000 dimensions, just as Jakarta does, and also at the same time the difficulties and the troubles and the richness of the project of our series, right? Trying to work across the Global South. And I think it's great that we've started with what the book calls the irreducible multiplicity of Jakarta, the city of 1,000 dimensions. So thank you everyone so much for this. Just a note that, as promised, we'll be flashing a discount code across the bottom of the screen. You can purchase the book from NUS Press website at a special discount for a little while. And I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you again, everyone, for such a great way to start off the week. Or end it, in the case of Abidin in North America.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Bye.
Thanks, Anoma. Bye.